Okay, welcome back everyone to America and Iran, the history. This is part 5. So let's just do a real quick review at the very end of part 4. When we left off yesterday, uh, Jimmy Carter had just come to Iran in 1977 to give a speech. And he said something in that speech, probably had something to do with the fact that he was talking about what a good friend that the Shah was, and how close we were with Iran, and how wonderful we all were. Probably not a good speech to give at that particular time. Clearly, Carter hadn't been properly briefed on exactly what was going on in Iran. So he gives this speech, and 2 days later, all hell breaks loose in Iran. Over 1.5 million people on the streets of Tehran, millions of people all over the country protesting, calling for, wanting Ayatollah Khomeini to be their new leader. They wanted the Shah gone. And at this point, we're talking primarily protest, but in massive, massive numbers. Now, watching some interviews of those individuals who were around the Shah, we can, I guess, call them his cabinet. The people around the Shah said that the Shah's response to this was that he was like blindsided, like a deer in the headlights, because he couldn't believe what was happening. He couldn't believe all the people on the streets, because he really believed that he was a benevolent king, that the people in Iran loved him, that they were happy with his reforms, and he could not understand what was happening. He was in shock, essentially. And he really did not know what to do. He did not know what to do. Back in Washington, of course, they're watching all this go on, and they're thinking, they're waiting for the Shah to do what his father certainly would have done, and what you would expect in a lot of these, Middle Eastern or maybe Latin American or Asian countries. You would expect they would do what these types of people who are dictators or kings or what have you, what they normally do is they send out the military to start cracking heads. But the Shah just didn't have it in him, because it's like he saw those as his people, and he wanted to serve them. He wanted to understand what the problem was, and he really wasn't interested in sending the military out to beat people down. He was an intellectual, and taking an intellectual approach to the situation, as opposed to his father. His father, in a drop of a hat, would have had the military out there gunning people down, but his son, not that way. So what the Shah did, these protests did not stop. They weren't like people came out, protested one day, and then they kind of went home. This was once Jimmy Carter gave that speech, 2 days afterward, once those riots and protests started, they never ended. It was nonstop, around the clock. They would grow larger and larger. In fact, at one point, as I said, they did impose martial law just to try to get people off the streets and try to start trying to deal with the situation. Of course, public safety was an issue. Commerce wasn't able to move. Nothing was basically happening. There were beginning to be general strikes, which meant nothing was moving. The subways weren't moving. The taxis weren't moving. Business wasn't moving. Nothing was happening except for chaos. So the Shah, after a couple of days of this, he goes on TV and he makes an announcement, gives I guess you'd say a speech, but more of an announcement, and says, "Hey, I'm your king, and I'm going to honor the Constitution. I respect the revolutionaries out on the streets, and I understand that they have grievances, and I expect to hear their grievances, and we expect to work this situation out. But in the meantime, I will honor the Constitution." And so he announces at that point that he and his family are going to go on an extended vacation. And of course, this really got the folks in Washington spinning, because at that point they understood at that point he probably was not going to use the military to bring the situation under control. Instead, he's going to go on vacation. So at this point, the Carter administration sends a general, a 3-star general, over to Iran, and he meets with the generals, the Shah's generals, and he says, "Hey, what's your plan?" And they basically inform him that they have no plan. They have no plan because they told this American general that it was believed by Iranian leaders that if you have a plan for a military takeover of a situation, that could be used as a coup against a king or a shah or what have you. So for that reason, they didn't want to have a plan in place. So they had no plan in place. And the Shah had made no definitive decision on what to do. But he did do essentially three things. Number one, he announced that he was going to take an extended vacation. He was going to follow the Constitution. He was going to respect the protesters, and give them a redress of their grievances or what have you. But what he did was he also appointed, in his absence, a man to kind of take his place. And this man he chose was a moderate. He was kind of somewhere in the middle. He respected the traditional beliefs and culture and values of the Iranian citizens, but he also was somewhat a reformer. He was a political opponent of the Shah's for quite a few years, but he was considered as a reasonable, moderate person who could maybe find the common ground. Also, though, one other thing that the Shah did, which caused the American government to lose all confidence in him, was that he essentially said that he realized that the protesters had all these demands and there was a lot of problems, and so in order to satisfy them, he was going to issue arrest warrants for 500 members of government, including many of those who were his friends and loyal people around him. He basically threw 500 of his friends and supporters and government officials under the bus before leaving on his extended vacation. And it was this action really that caused the U.S. government, the Carter administration, to realize that the Shah was no longer really in control of the situation, and that his approach to dealing with it was not what they wanted to see. And so they essentially decided to, wash their hands of him. And so they turned to the military. And so they had this military general that they had over in Iran. They had him go to the military command there in Iran and basically make a statement to them that, hey, the President Carter wants you to know that he's got your back and he supports you 100%. So this was supposed to be a subtle message, not an order from the U.S. government, but certainly a probably slightly more than subtle message to the Iranian military officers that we support you if you want to go out and put this thing down by military force. But that did not happen. Okay, so the Shah takes off on vacation. He leaves. This moderate takes over, at which point the protest and the riots continued, and they grew more and more and more. And so the Carter administration at that point decided that that they needed to contact their people at the embassy and start thinking about what they might do as far as pulling people out of the embassy because it was getting dangerous, which they did. They pulled a lot of people out of the embassy, but they still left behind about 50 or 60 or so people. But they started pulling people out of the embassy. And also, Carter did one other thing. There was a French diplomat, because remember, Khomeini is in France. So there was a French diplomat that Carter knew quite well, and he had access to the Ayatollah. So he sent a message via a third party to this Frenchman and had told him to give a message to Ayatollah Khomeini that the American government would be very, very pleased if he would stay away from Iran and not go back there, because it would only make the situation even worse. And so Carter was asking Khomeini not to return to Iran as these situations were playing out there. And according to the Frenchman, Ayatollah Khomeini listened to the message, but didn't really say one way or another whether or not he would, do that or not. So he got the message, but he didn't respond either way to whether or not he would return to Iran or not. Well, by this time, a couple weeks go by, and the protests are getting larger and larger. Now they're turning into riots. They're beginning now to attack some military and police forces at that time. The rioters are attacking the police now. The country is moving into complete chaos, and so now we start seeing members of the police and the army in Iran that supported the Ayatollah beginning to desert, because now they're seeing the tipping point as clearly moving towards the rioters, the protesters, or what have you, and moving away from the Shah. The Shah's out of the country. The moderates basically doing nothing. The military is frozen. They're basically doing nothing more at that point than just trying to provide security and taking a defensive posture. They were not out there aggressively in an offensive posture, beating down the protesters. They were just providing kind of security and being defensive. But once the people started deserting, that made it perfectly clear to the military that the game was just about up. And at this point, this takes us up to February of the 1st of 1979. And at this point, the Ayatollah decides it's time to leave France and go back to Iran, which he does. So he goes back to Iran, and of course he's greeted and welcomed by millions and millions and millions of happy supporters, happy to see him. So Khomeini comes back. He starts giving a series of speeches where he says, proclaiming that he is now the new leader of Iran. He is the supreme leader. He will be making all the decisions, and that he's the man, and that the Shah's regime is over, and that they are going to reinstate the Islamic Republic. So this goes on for about another 10 days after the Ayatollah comes back to Iran and announces that he's now basically taking over. The military at that point, for about 10 days, were still unsure as to what to do. I expect some of them were probably trying to get out of the country, but the higher echelon were still talking to American generals, were still talking to people at the embassy. They were probably talking to European leaders. They were even talking to the Khomeini's people, because at this point, once the Ayatollah came back, and it was obvious that the Islamic Republic was back, and the military was not trying to they weren't trying to kill him or capture him or do anything like that. So at that point, the protests and the riots turned into essentially a military effort, because the protesters and rioters now began sacking ammo dumps and weapons places, getting weapons, getting ammo, and they began assaulting the police and the military, assaulting police and military compounds, and so they got very aggressive. And it was at that point when the negotiations with the Iranian military began to get very serious, as far as we got to make a decision pretty quick what to do. So over that last 10 days, once the Ayatollah came back, that's what it was with the military, just a series of negotiations for how to act in the absence of the Shah, and with the moderate who was in charge, who was doing really nothing, just kind of going whichever way the wind was blowing. So finally, 11 days after the Ayatollah returned back to Iran and the Shah had left, finally the military announced that the revolution was over, that it was a success, that they would stand down, and that they would no longer resist the revolution, and that they would accept Ayatollah Khomeini and the new Islamic Republic. So that's where we are at that point. It's now 1979. The Shah is gone. The moderate is gone. He's boogied out of the country. Most of the military had left the country. Some of them stuck around, and now they were essentially part of the military for Ayatollah Khomeini, who by February 1st, 1979, had appointed himself and was well received by the Iranian public as the new Ayatollah, the new leader, supreme leader of Iran. and that they were now once again an Islamic Republic. Okay, so I'm going to leave it right there for today, and that is pretty much how that all played out. So tomorrow we'll get into part 6, and we'll talk about what happened, what the Shah did, where he went. We'll talk about the events that transpired that led up to the major event, which is probably the single biggest thing that has poisoned relations between the United States and Iran, and that event was known as the hostage crisis. So that's what we're going to be getting into tomorrow, and there'll probably be 2 more videos on this subject, and we should just about have covered it all, at least ways for the narrow perspective that we're taking to try to understand why the United States and Iran have the relationship that we have. So we'll get back at it tomorrow. We'll be pretty close to finishing this thing up. Thank you for tuning in. I hope that we're all learning something here, and hopefully we're all coming to a better understanding of why the relationship between the U.S. and Iran is so poor, and why it seems so difficult to ever see an improvement in that relationship. And I think by the time we finish this video, I think we'll all be very clear as to why that is. So thanks for tuning in. If you like this video, give me a thumbs up. Subscribe. I'd love it if you subscribe to my channel. Subscribers are great. And I look forward to talking to you tomorrow. Alrighty, bye.